My name is Roland Keller. I am 71 years old, and I built my life from the ground up in Minneapolis. Until last Tuesday, I believed the worst pain a man could ever endure was burying his wife. I was wrong. That morning, I walked out to the garage to check on my late wife's pride and joy, a flawless 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda she had spent 25 years restoring with her own two hands. Instead of the car, I found an empty concrete bay and a single, fresh drip of oil. I called my 38-year-old son, Wesley, and over the roar of an airport terminal, he told me, as casually as a man ordering coffee, that he had sold it. "Mom is gone, Dad," he said. "Why are you hoarding a rusted piece of scrap? Sienna's been depressed. She needed Paris to clear her head. Get over it." I was devastated. And then, 1 hour later, my phone rang. It was Sal Marchetti, an old classic car dealer, and his voice was urgent. "Roland, your son just dumped the Cuda here for a fast cash wire. You need to come down. Vivian left something hidden inside the door panel. You have to see this." One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, grief, and quiet strength are very real. Before we go on, if you have ever been betrayed by your own flesh and blood, hit the like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It genuinely means a great deal to an old man to know who is listening. Now, let us begin. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 months to the day since I buried my wife, Vivian. 42 years of marriage, gone in the space of a single afternoon to a sudden cardiac arrest. The house had felt immense and hollow ever since. Vivian was the fire in my life, the spark that helped me grow Keller Cold Chain from a single rented refrigerated truck into a fleet of 380 rigs running frozen freight across the whole upper Midwest. But her real passion, her absolute obsession, lived out in the garage. A 1970 Hemi Cuda, sublime green with a black shaker hood, a car she had chased original parts for across 3 continents and rebuilt bolt by bolt over a quarter of a century. That car was not metal and rubber. It was a piece of her soul poured into steel. Since she passed, I had gone out to that garage every single morning, just to breathe in the oil and the leather, just to feel close to her for a few minutes before the loneliness settled back in. That Tuesday, I pushed open the heavy door with a cup of black coffee in my hand, and I stopped dead. The mug slipped from my fingers and shattered on the concrete, hot coffee splashing across my boots, and I barely felt it. The bay was empty. The space where the Cuda had sat the night before was violently, obscenely vacant, and the only proof it had ever existed was a dark drip of oil in the center of the floor. A cold panic seized my chest. I checked the side door. Locked. I checked the main garage mechanism. Intact. No broken glass, no forced entry, no alarm triggered. Whoever took it had used the master key. They knew the codes. They knew exactly how to bypass the sensors. And only 2 people besides me had that access. My estate manager, who was in Arizona visiting his grandchildren, and my son, Wesley. Wesley, 38 years old, living in a glass and steel monstrosity 3 blocks away that I had put the down payment on. A man whose taste for the finer things had accelerated violently the day he married Sienna 4 years ago. My hands shook as I dialed his number. It rang 3 times before he picked up. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" His voice was far too casual. and behind it I could hear the echoing announcements and the dull crowd roar of an airport terminal. "Wesley," I said, my voice tight, "where are you, and where is your mother's car?" There was a pause, but it was not a pause of guilt. It was a pause of annoyance, as though I were bothering him with a trivial thing. "I'm at the airport, Dad. Sienna and I are heading to Europe for a couple of weeks." "I did not ask about your vacation," I snapped, the anger finally cutting through the shock. "I asked where the CUDA is." He sighed, the long-suffering sigh of a man explaining something obvious to a child. "I sold it." The words hit me like a fist, and I had to grip the workbench to stay standing. "You what?" "I sold it," he repeated, louder, over a boarding call. "Mom's been gone 6 months. Why are you hoarding a piece of scrap that just gathers dust and makes you miserable every time you look at it?" "That car," I hissed, "was your mother's life's work. It was not yours to sell. You stole it." He actually scoffed. "Stole it? Don't be dramatic, Dad. I'm your only heir. It was going to be mine eventually. I just moved the timeline up. Besides, I needed the liquidity. Sienna's been severely depressed since Mom passed. She needs Paris to clear her head." I almost laughed, a bitter, ugly sound, because Sienna had not shed one genuine tear at Vivian's funeral. She had complained about the temperature of the shrimp at the wake. But I said none of that. I stood in my empty garage, breathing hard, and I let him talk. Because I have learned across 4 decades of hard business that you learn far more from a man who thinks he has already won than from one who knows he is being watched. He told me to get over it. He told me it was healthy for me to let go of the past. Then he told me his flight was boarding, and he hung up on his own father, standing in the ruins of the one place that still smelled like my dead wife. I want you to understand who Vivian was, because everything that came after depends on it. When I met her, I was 24 years old with one leased truck, a bad back, and more ambition than sense. She was the sharpest mind I had ever encountered, a woman who could look at a column of numbers and see the lie hiding inside it before anyone else saw the numbers at all. For 30 years, she ran the finances of Keller Cold Chain with a precision that made auditors nervous, and she built the whole security architecture of our network herself because she trusted machines more than she trusted men, and she was usually right to. But her heart, her actual joy, lived in that garage with the CUDA. She used to say that a company was a thing you fought to keep, but that car was a thing you built for love, and that the difference between the two was the difference between surviving and living. Wesley grew up watching her rebuild that engine piece by piece. He knew, better than anyone alive, exactly what it meant to her. And that is what made selling it not a mistake, but a message. I was still standing there, the phone cold in my hand, when it rang again an hour later. The name on the screen was Sal Marchetti. Sal had run the largest classic and vintage dealership in the Twin Cities for 30 years. He was a rough, honest, old-school man who had known Vivian well because she had bought half her rare parts through him and trusted no one else. "Sal," I answered. "Roland," he said, and there was an edge in his gravel voice I had never heard before. "Your boy was just here, Wesley. He rolled the CUDA in this morning demanding an immediate cash wire, no negotiation, no paperwork, like the car was on fire. I gave him a fair number just to get him out of my lot, because something about it stank. But Roland, listen to me. During the intake inspection, my guy pulled the interior door panel to check the window mechanism. There is something hidden inside the door cavity. Vivian put it there. I would know her handiwork anywhere. It has your name on it. You need to come down here right now before anyone else touches it." I did not say another word to Sal. I set the phone down, walked past the shattered mug, and got into my daily driver. The drive across the city was a blur of gray winter light, but my mind had gone strangely, coldly quiet, the way it used to go quiet in the seconds before a brutal negotiation. Vivian had hidden something in that car. Vivian, who had spent 30 years as my chief financial officer before she ever picked up a wrench. A woman who could read a balance sheet like scripture and smell a lie through a phone line. She had taken the time to hide something deep inside a door panel of a car she had to have known might one day be sold. And a woman like Vivian did not do anything by accident. I pulled up to the security gate of Sal's cavernous warehouse, and he was already waiting for me just inside, his arms crossed, his face grim. He did not offer me coffee or small talk. He simply walked me across the concrete floor to where the CUDA sat under the floodlights, its green paint gleaming like something alive. And he pointed to the driver's door, panel removed, wiring exposed. Right there, buried deep in the dark cavity of the door, wedged behind the window track, was a slim, fireproof bag sealed in reinforced waterproof tape. Sal reached in with a gloved hand, worked it free, and set it on his workbench. My hands, which had stayed steady through hostile labor negotiations and vicious corporate raiders, began to tremble. Through the translucent material, I could see two shapes: a black USB flash drive and a folded sheet of heavy stock parchment. It was Vivian's writing stationery. I picked up a utility knife from the bench, sliced the tape, and pulled out the parchment, and the moment I unfolded it, her sharp, elegant cursive stopped the breath in my throat. The date in the top corner was 14 days before the coronary that took her. She had written this letter 2 weeks before she died. The ink was dark and pressed deep into the page, the way she wrote when she meant every word. "Roland," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means our son took the bait." A freezing chill spread from the base of my spine to my fingertips, and I forced my eyes to keep moving down the page. You always wanted to believe the best about Wesley. You told yourself his arrogance was a phase, that Sienna's greed was youth she would outgrow. But I spent my whole professional life tracking liabilities, and I am telling you now, our son is the single greatest liability this family has ever produced. So I left a pre-signed blank title to this car hidden in the bottom of the glove box. I knew that the moment I was gone, Wesley would go hunting for liquid assets to feed Sienna's appetite. I wanted to test him. I wanted to know if he would protect the things I loved or sell me out for fast, untraceable cash. If this letter is in your hands, my love, then you already have your answer. I stopped reading. My chest was heaving. My wife had built a loyalty test that reached out of the grave, and the boy we raised, the boy I had funded and shielded his whole life, had failed it in the most spectacular way imaginable. He had not hesitated. He had not mourned. He had simply seen his mother's death as a blank check to cash. I had to set the letter down on the workbench for a moment and steady myself against it. My whole life, I had been the one who saw the angles, who read the room, who knew when a handshake hid a knife. And yet Vivian, quietly, from her hospital-adjacent study, had seen a truth about our own son that I had refused to see for years. She had loved Wesley as fiercely as I did, and because she loved him, she had done the hardest thing a mother can do. She had stopped hoping he was better than the evidence, and she had built a test to find out for certain, knowing the answer would break my heart, and knowing I needed it to be broken before I could protect what mattered. She had used the last clear months of her life not to rest, not to say long goodbyes, but to hunt. For me, for the company, for everything the two of us had bled to build. And she had trusted that when the moment came, I would be strong enough to read her handwriting and do what she could no longer do herself. But the letter did not end there. I swallowed the hard knot in my throat and read the final paragraph. This is not just about a stolen car, Roland. Wesley is not simply a spoiled child throwing a tantrum. He is actively funding a betrayal that will destroy everything we spent our lives building. The USB in this bag holds everything I have been secretly investigating for the last 6 months. I did not want to bring it to you until I had airtight proof, but my heart has been failing, and I am afraid I am running out of time. Plug it into a secure machine. Follow the banking routes. Do not let your father's heart blind you to the cold, hard math. Burn the rot out of our house, Roland. Do what has to be done. I folded the parchment along its worn creases and slid it into my jacket, and I lifted the small black drive out of the bag. It weighed nothing, and it felt heavier than an engine block. Vivian had spent the last months of her life protecting me from a threat I had been too blind and too grieving to see. I looked at Sal, and I told him I needed the secure computer in his back office. He nodded once and led me down the hall without a single question. The drive was encrypted, of course. Vivian never left anything unprotected. She had designed the security protocols for our entire logistics network herself, back in the days when we still counted trucks on a chalkboard. I typed in the long alphanumeric sequence we had always reserved for corporate emergencies, and a single master folder bloomed onto the screen, titled simply with our son's name. Inside was a meticulously organized archive, 6 months of work, subfolders labeled with offshore bank names and transfer dates and corporate registries. I opened the first one, marked Travel. Wesley had sworn he sold the car to fund a Paris trip for his depressed wife. The first document was a genuine receipt, 2 first-class tickets to Charles de Gaulle and a suite near the Louvre. For half a second, a terrible confusion washed over me. Had he actually been telling the truth? Then I opened the very next file. It was a cancellation confirmation. The Paris flights and the hotel had been booked on a Tuesday and fully refunded 48 hours later. The entire European vacation was a phantom, a cheap and disposable decoy. It was a smokescreen, and an intelligent one. Wesley knew that if he told me he was blowing money on a frivolous luxury trip, I would be angry, but I would eventually dismiss it as typical spoiled behavior and stop looking. The real travel manifest was in the next file. Wesley and Sienna were not flying to France. They had booked 2 seats on a private charter out of a small regional airfield, and their destination was Georgetown in the Cayman Islands. The Caymans are not famous for their mental health retreats. They are famous for being one of the largest offshore tax havens and anonymous banking capitals on Earth. A cold, heavy understanding began to settle in my gut. The money from the CUDA was not for shopping. My son was moving raw, untraceable capital offshore. I remember the exact moment the floor dropped out from under me, because it was so quiet. There was no shattering glass, no shouting, just a receipt for a private charter to Georgetown glowing on a borrowed laptop in the back of a car warehouse. For 6 months, I had pitied my son. I had told myself he was grieving in his own broken way, that his coldness was a shield, that somewhere under the arrogance was the boy who used to hand his mother wrenches in that garage. And in a single line of a flight manifest, all of that pity curdled into something else. A man does not book a secret charter to a banking haven because he is sad. A man does not launder his grief through the Cayman Islands. Every gentle excuse I had made for him over 6 long months collapsed at once. and I understood that the loving son I had been mourning alongside my wife had never actually existed. I had been grieving a fiction. The real Wesley had stood in that garage the night before, disabling his own dead mother's security system to steal the last thing she ever loved. I backed out and opened the next major directory, labeled Corporate Acquisitions, and the screen filled with hundreds of pages of scanned legal documents, offshore banking forms, and intercepted email chains. Vivian had tracked a series of communications between Wesley and an offshore holding firm in Georgetown that specialized in one thing: anonymous, aggressive, hostile corporate buyouts. I scrolled down to the target of the acquisition, and my heart stopped. The company being purchased through that untraceable shell was Meridian Cold Logistics. Meridian was my single largest and most vicious competitor in the entire region. For a decade, Keller and Meridian had clawed at each other over every major refrigerated contract in the upper Midwest. We held the grocery chains, they held the pharmaceutical routes. And at that very moment, we were locked in a multi-year, multi-million-dollar bidding war over a regional agricultural supply contract that would decide operational dominance for the next 20 years. I opened the final financial attachment, the formal escrow demand from the Cayman firm. The required initial cash deposit to trigger the Meridian buyout was exactly $340,000. That was the precise market value of Vivian's fully restored CUDA. My son had not sold his mother's car for a vacation. He had liquidated her soul to make a down payment on the destruction of his own father's empire. I sat back in Sal's leather chair, the pale glow of the screen lighting up the full darkness of my new reality, and I understood the whole shape of it. Wesley was a trusted executive inside my company. He had unrestricted daily access to our operating margins, our fuel and maintenance costs, our exact pricing algorithms, every strategic strength and every operational weakness of Keller Cold Chain. The plan was sickeningly simple. Buy our struggling rival anonymously through a Caribbean shell, then use his insider knowledge to systematically undercut every bid I made, bleed my contracts over to Meridian one by one, and bankrupt his own father from the shadows, all while reaping the untaxed profits offshore. He needed the fast cash from the car because his own money was tied up entirely in Sienna's lifestyle. He had stolen his dead mother's legacy to finance the assassination of everything she and I had built together. And he had done it while looking me in the eye and telling me to get over it. I need you to grasp the elegance of what he had walked into because it was truly vicious. Meridian Cold Logistics was not a healthy company. It was drowning, buried in debt, one bad quarter from collapse, kept alive only because it still held those lucrative pharmaceutical routes. On its own, it was no threat to me at all. But in the hands of a man who knew my exact pricing algorithms, my fuel contracts, my margins to the penny, Meridian became a scalpel aimed straight at my throat. Every bid I submitted, they could undercut by just enough. Every long-term client I had spent decades earning, they could quietly poison. They would not beat me in a fair fight. They would bleed me, contract by contract, season by season, until the empire I built from one rented truck simply ran out of blood, and no one would ever be able to prove why. And the worst part, from their side, was that the man doing the bleeding would be my own son, hidden behind a shell company on an island, feasting on the corpse of his father's life, while attending my funeral with dry eyes. For a long time, I did not speak. The grief that had crushed me for 6 months, the suffocating weight of losing Vivian, began to burn off, and in its place rose something white-hot and absolutely clear. But I was not finished. because Vivian had not been finished. I opened one more directory labeled Internal Communications, and it filled with forwarded email chains and mirrored server logs. The top thread was a tactical breakdown of Keller cold chain's supply routes and most vulnerable client contracts, sent from a scrambled, anonymous account. But the phrasing, the specific logistics terminology, the corporate voice of it, was far too familiar. At the bottom, Vivian had attached an IP trace, and she had tracked that anonymous account to a single terminal inside my own headquarters. Terminal 4. My breath caught. Terminal 4 belonged to Curtis Vaughn. Curtis was my vice president of operations, a man I had personally hired 6 years ago out of a failing firm because I saw a hungry, driven executive who reminded me of myself at that age. I had mentored him. I had paid him a fortune. I had handed him the keys to my empire. And here he was, quietly engineering its destruction. I sat very still with that for a long moment, because in some ways, Vaughn's betrayal cut deeper than my own son's. Wesley was blood, and blood makes people stupid and selfish in predictable ways. But Curtis Vaughn, I had chosen. I had seen a young man clawing his way up out of a dying company, hungry and sharp and underestimated, and I had recognized myself in him and decided to lift him. I had defended him to my board when they called him too aggressive. I had put him in rooms he had no right to be in yet, taught him how the industry really worked, trusted him with the operational heart of everything I owned. He had eaten at my table. He had shaken my hand at Vivian's funeral and told me, with what I now understood was a rehearsed and hollow warmth, that she had been like a mother to him. And the whole time, he had been at Terminal 4 in the small hours, mapping the softest parts of my company for a foreign buyer, using the mentorship I had given him as the blueprint for my ruin. I had handed him the knife myself and taught him exactly where to put it. As I read the chains between Vaughn and the offshore firm, the true architecture came clear, and it was worse than I thought. Wesley was not the mastermind. My son, for all his expensive degree and towering arrogance, simply did not have the mind to orchestrate a shadow acquisition of a major competitor. Wesley was a useful idiot. He was the bloodline connection, the family access to untraceable capital that the deposit required. Vaughn had fed him a fantasy that the two of them would secretly seize Meridian and rule the market together as partners. Vaughn provided the blueprints and the strategy. Wesley provided the stolen cash. And in a third folder, one Vivian had separated from the rest and labeled with only Sienna's name, I found the final rot. Sienna had known Curtis Vaughn for years, long before she ever met my son. She was the bridge between them. She had been steered into Wesley's life on purpose, a designed marriage, an inside line to the Keller fortune. My son had not chosen his wife. He had been chosen, harvested, and set up as the disposable face of a theft he was too vain to even fully understand. I sat with that revelation the longest, because it reframed the entire marriage I had watched unfold for 4 years. Every warning sign I had dismissed as ordinary gold digging suddenly rearranged itself into something colder and far more deliberate. The way Sienna had appeared in Wesley's life just as he took his executive seat, the way she had steered him toward luxuries he could not afford, keeping him always a little desperate, always a little indebted, always reaching for the next payout. The way she had never quite warmed to Vivian, the one person in our family sharp enough to see through her. It had not been a marriage at all. It had been a long, patient operation, and my son, so proud of the beautiful wife on his arm, had never once suspected that he was the mark, not the prize. Vivian had seen it in the first year. She had said nothing to me because she knew I would defend him, and instead she had begun, quietly, to build the file that now glowed in front of me. My wife had understood our family better in dying than I had in living it. I ejected the drive, slipped it into my pocket next to Vivian's letter, and I thanked Sal for his discretion. On the drive home, the tired, grieving husband simply dissolved, and in his place, the wartime chief executive I had buried along with my ambition finally stood back up. Vivian had spent her final days on Earth arming me for a war I did not even know was being waged, and she had handed me the exact weapon I needed. Wesley wanted to play the ruthless offshore raider. Curtis Vaughn wanted to be the shadow king of the cold chain. They had both forgotten one thing. I did not claw my way to the top of the most brutal logistics market in the country by showing mercy to thieves, and I had never, not once, needed to raise my voice to end a man. I locked myself in my home office, closed the blinds, and I did not act in anger. I acted the way I had built everything, methodically, patiently, and completely. I called my attorney, and then I called a contact at the field office of the federal government, and I began to assemble Vivian's evidence into something no lawyer on earth could untangle. I did not warn my son. I did not stop his flight. I let Wesley and Sienna fly to the Cayman Islands believing they had won, believing the old man was home weeping over a missing car. I let them walk into the Georgetown offices of the offshore holding firm and put their names in person on the escrow documents to trigger the Meridian buyout, because a crime committed in person in a foreign banking capital with a stolen deposit and a federal wire behind it is a crime that no amount of expensive legal talent can later pretend was a misunderstanding. While they signed their own indictment on a tropical island, I sat down with my attorney at home and executed the two documents that mattered most. The first froze Wesley's access to the family trust and removed him permanently and irrevocably from my will. The second was a formal internal referral, backed by Vivian's airtight files, that placed the entire conspiracy, Wesley, Sienna, and Curtis Vaughn, into the hands of federal investigators for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and international money laundering. The takedown, when it came, was quiet and total, the way real power always is. I did not need to be in the room for any of it, and that was the point. A man who has to shout, who has to storm into an office and overturn a desk, is a man who has already lost control of the situation. I had spent 40 years learning that the most devastating thing you can do to an enemy is to let him keep sprinting confidently toward a cliff you have already mapped. So I stayed home. I watered the plants Vivian had loved. I answered a few routine emails so that nothing at the company seemed out of the ordinary. And 200 miles of paperwork away, the machinery of consequence turned exactly as I had arranged it. Federal agents were waiting when Wesley and Sienna landed back on American soil, still tanned, still arguing in the customs line about which luxury district they would buy into once the Meridian deal paid out. Curtis Vaughn was arrested at Terminal 4, in the very chair where he had betrayed me, and walked out through a lobby full of the employees whose pensions he had gambled, none of whom would meet his eyes. My son called me from a holding cell, the arrogance gone, weeping, begging me to fix it, swearing it was all Vaughn, swearing Sienna had manipulated him. And Sienna, from her own cell, told the prosecutors it was all Wesley, that she was a frightened wife who knew nothing. They turned on each other so fast and so completely that the judge barely needed the evidence Vivian had spent her dying months compiling. All three were convicted. Wesley and Sienna received 10 years each in a federal penitentiary, and Curtis Vaughn, as the architect, received more. Their tropical paradise became cold concrete and steel bars, and the dream of ruling my empire from the shadows ended in a courtroom, exactly as my wife had planned, from beyond her own grave. With the parasites cut out of my life, I turned my attention back to Keller Cold Chain, because the betrayal had exposed a deep rot in the executive level of my own house. I did not hesitate. I purged the entire top floor. Every vice president and director and senior manager who had enabled Vaughn or simply looked the other way while my company was pointed at its own destruction. Then, to fill the void, I did not go hunting for polished outside executives with fancy degrees and hollow promises. I went down to the loading docks. I promoted the warehouse managers and the shift supervisors and the dispatchers who had given decades of their lives to the actual work of moving freight through blizzards and heat waves. The people who knew the business better than any boardroom politician ever could. A fierce, loyal energy came back into that company almost overnight. The same energy Vivian and I had built it on. I will tell you the exact moment I knew the company would survive. A week after the promotions, I walked the loading dock at 5 in the morning, the way I used to before the boardroom swallowed me, and a dispatcher named Yolanda, a woman who had routed my trucks through 20 winters, looked up from her screen and simply said, "Good to have you back on the floor, boss." That was all. But it was the first sentence in 6 months that had reached me through the grief. And I understood then that the rot had never been in the work or in the workers. It had been in the marble offices upstairs, among men in expensive suits who had never once loaded a pallet or salted a ramp at dawn. Men who saw the company as a thing to be leveraged rather than a thing to be tended. Vivian always understood that. She trusted the people with grease on their hands, and she was suspicious of anyone whose hands were too clean. In the end, she was right about that, as she was right about nearly everything, including our son. As for the $340,000 Wesley stole from his mother's estate, the federal authorities recovered every cent from the frozen Cayman accounts, and when the money cleared, I knew exactly what Vivian would have wanted me to do with it. I did not fold it back into my corporate holdings. I established the Vivian Keller Trades Foundation, and I put the entire sum toward apprenticeships and scholarships for young people who want to learn to work with their hands. Mechanics and machinists and restorers, kids with grease under their nails, and no rich father to fund a fancy degree. Her name would never be attached to a fraudulent shell company on a Caribbean island. Her name would be attached to teaching a new generation to build things that last, exactly as she had built that car, and I had built that company. This evening, the sky above Minneapolis is a bruised canvas of purple and burning orange, and the last of the sun lays long gold shadows across the concrete of my garage. I walk slowly to the far corner, where the 1970 Cuda sits again, recovered and restored to its proper home, its green paint gleaming in the fading light. I pull the key from my pocket, open the heavy driver's door, and slide into the leather seat that still holds the faint memory of my wife. I run my hand along the wooden rim of the wheel she rebuilt with her own fingers, and I turn the key. The engine wakes with a deep, thunderous roar that shakes the foundation of the garage. A perfect machine, built by a woman who was more perfect than any machine. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson beneath it is as real as steel and frost. Greed is a venom that blinds you to the very hands that feed you. And when you treat your family as nothing more than a resource to be drained, you forfeit every right to their loyalty and their love. Never mistake an old man's silence for surrender, and never underestimate a parent's willingness to burn his own empire to the ground rather than let the rats have the feast. They wanted my inheritance. In the end, the only thing they inherited was the ruin they earned with their own hands. My name is Roland Keller, and the legacy they tried to steal, I gave to the ones who would honor it. In my wife's name.